Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zip Nguyen. I'm the president and CEO for the Center for Applied Linguistics, and we're very honored to co-sponsor this very important event. NCEL, or the National Committee for Effective Literacy, has been a leading advocate for developing effective biliteracy for multilingual learners. And this particular study is a critical part of that collaboration. So Cal is very proud to be a partner in this effort. You are in for a treat, and welcome to the webinar.
Welcome also to the webinar. I am Marta Hernandez with Californians Together and the National Committee for Effective Literacy. The National Committee for Effective Literacy advances, if we could go to the next slide, thank you, advances research, policies, and practices to ensure that emergent bilingual students develop strong literacy skills in English and ideally additional languages while thriving academically and within their communities. NCEL brings together educators, researchers, and advocates who are deeply committed to promoting literacy policies and practices that address the needs of multilingual learners across the country. As discussions around literacy policies and the state science of reading continue to shape instructional practices, NCEL plays a critical role in ensuring that English learners are not left out of these conversations. The committee works to challenge policies that may unintentionally narrow educational opportunities for multilingual students. NCEL was established in response to concerns nationwide about the narrow interpretation and implementation of the science of reading, and also the urgent need to uplift decades of research on effective literacy instruction for English learners and emergent bilinguals. And so with us presenting today, we have, if we can go to the next slide, please. With us, we have Dr. Kim Strong, who is an assistant research professor with the Bueno Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research centers bilingual students and families, as well as the teachers that serve them by using critical frameworks and large-scale data sets to understand the impacts of education policy. With us also, we have Dr. Kathy Escamilla, professor in the Division of Equity, Bilingualism, and Biliteracy at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research focuses on bilingual education, biliteracy development, and the impact of literacy policies on emergent bilingual students. She has been a leading voice in advocating for equitable research-based literacy instruction for multilingual learners. We also have Shelley Spiegel-Coleman, who is the strategic advisor for Californians Together, a longtime advocate for English learners and bilingual education. And as the former executive director of Californians Together, she has been instrumental in shaping policies that support multilingualism and education policy. We also have, on the next slide, an amazing panel of educators from around the country who are lending their voice on the findings of this report. We have with us Beatriz Chate, professor at City College of New York, Wendy Sue Clausen, ESL teacher with the Virginia Beach School District in Virginia. We have Maureen Kuhn Rojas, English Learner Program Coordinator, Summit 105 in nearby Chicago in Illinois. And we have Julie Nora, Director of the International Charter School in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And next slide, please. Last year, or really maybe it's been a year and a half, NCEL collaborated with the Reading League to develop what we call the joint statement, Understanding the Difference, the Science of Reading and Implementation for English Learners, Emergent Bilinguals. And since its release, educators across the country have raised concerns about the restrictive mandates resulting from state and district policies, as well as legislation that fail to align with the joint statement's principles or the research on literacy for multilingual learners. So in response, NCEL partnered with researchers Dr. Kathy Escamilla and Dr. Kimberly Strong and to capture the voices of nearly 80 educators. And through their testimonials, and this report documents the real world impact of science of reading policies on multilingual learners in both biliteracy and English instructional programs. And so the need for the study, on the next slide, please. The need for the study, of course, we know that during 2021 to 22 school year, approximately 5.3 million students in U.S. schools were identified as English learners, representing about 10% of the total K-12 population. Over the past decade, a dominant narrative has emerged, framing the U.S. as facing a national literacy crisis affecting all children, one attributed to reading instruction methods. The science of reading movement has positioned itself as the solution to this perceived crisis. A Shanker Institute survey found that 80% of states, 40 out of 50, have implemented some form of science of reading mandate. Among these, 4 and 5 states, 32 total, mention emergent bilinguals or English learners, only to state that they are included under the directive without really providing specific guidance tailored to their needs. Additionally, 1 in 3 science of reading states failed to mention emergent bilinguals, English learners at all. So this highlights a critical gap in literacy policy where English learners are often overlooked in the science of reading implementation. And so we are very, very excited to share this important work with you today. We encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A, and we will be attempting to answer all of those during the session, but if not, we will make sure to get those answered and get those answers to you. So at this time, let's dive into the study methods, key findings, and what they mean for the future of literacy education for English learners, emergent bilinguals, with Dr. Kimberly Strong. Kim?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm a co-author on this study, and in order to address this very real need, as Martha discussed, we asked the research question: how has the implementation of the state initiatives related to the science of reading impacted the ability of teachers to implement comprehensive reading programs for emergent bilinguals, EBs, or ELs? All of our data were then disaggregated by folks who are working in dual language or bilingual contexts, and also English medium programs, because we really wanted to understand if these impacts are felt differently depending on the language of instruction and the kind of language program that teachers are working in. In this study, we interviewed 77 educators across the US using an interview protocol and constructed responses. The interview protocol and the constructed answer responses looked at 3 different main areas. One, just getting to understand educators' contexts, where they're working, how long have they been in the fields, their grade level, what kind of program they're in. Then we did a deep dive into the kind of literacy curriculum that they were mandated or asked to use and what it looked like to them, what were the requirements, what were the goals of that curriculum, and finally, the extent to which that curriculum instruction has been modified or is amenable to the unique needs of emergent bilingual students. All of our transcripts were analyzed and coded using an inductive framework by our research team. Thinking about the folks who responded to our study that we talked to, they represented more or less an even geographic distribution of the country, a quarter about coming from the Midwest and the West, as well as the Northeast, 20%, and Mid-Atlantic, South, a little lower representation. But it's important to note that these responders aren't only representing one corner of the country, they really are a snapshot of what's happening across the nation. Our study participants understandably overwhelmingly represented the elementary grades, and we know that these are the places where early literacy is being developed and these curricula would be in more full force. And so about 3 and 4 of our participants worked exclusively at the elementary grades. A few worked in secondary contexts or across elementary and secondary. There's a even representation of language program focus. 40%, so 4 and 10, were in English only, ESL or ELD or sheltered contexts. Almost 40% likewise worked in dual language and bilingual contexts. And interestingly, 20%, so 1 in 5, worked in mixed contexts, both serving English focused or English only programs, as well as native language or bilingual programs. And so thinking about those folks who were working across programs, they tended to represent directors, coordinators, specialists, interventionists. And so these would be people who are in different classrooms, different schools, sometimes all the schools in the district. So while about half of our respondents were classroom teachers, the other half were working in these roles, supporting the education in a variety of contexts. This is just a short overview of some of the roles that are represented in our study. And with that, I will hand it over to my co-author.
Hello, everyone. Kathy Escamilla here, and I am in charge of presenting the findings. I want to say that I'm very excited about these findings because I think if you really want to know how well any kind of a mandate is being taken up, you look at and ask the people who are directly responsible for implementing it. And in this case, it's the people working closest to our children. So there are 7 major findings, which I'm going to present in 2 sets. I'm going to present 4 findings first, and then invite our panel of experts from various school districts across the country to amplify and add to the findings from their perspective. And then I'm going to present findings 5 through 7, but there are 7 major findings. The first one, hoping that, yes, here we go. Finding 1 is balancing foundational skills instruction. So I want to say this, and I think it's very important. There was a narrative 5 to 10 years ago that somehow teachers were ignoring the teaching of foundational skills, and that somehow they needed to be brought back to more of a focus on foundational skills. We did not find that at all. In fact, the teachers who in our study overwhelmingly said that they recognize the value of phonics and other foundational skills, but they struggle with the increased amount of time that they're being asked to implement the foundational skills and still deal with all the other parts of their curriculum. Teachers acknowledged, and here this is finding 1 broken down a bit. Teachers acknowledged the need to have a well-defined foundational skills program, and 36% of them reported that SOR elements have positively impacted their curricula and instruction because of a better defined foundational skills program. They appreciated having systematic phonics programs that outlined approaches to teaching letter names and sounds, but questioned how these methods may need to be modified for emerging bilingual students who are learning to their initial literacy in languages other than English. The finding, as I said before, challenges the narrative that before the SOR mandates, teachers either were not interested or did not teach phonics and other foundation skills and had been encouraged from doing so. However, all foundation skills are not created equally. And as you know, phonics is but one of the foundational skills. In many settings, our teachers told us that there's an overemphasis on phonics and not enough time to do everything. The amount of time required of teaching phonics every day varies greatly across the districts that were in our study. from 10 minutes a day to 60 minutes a day, and from 45 minutes to 60 minutes per day of teaching phonics and English doesn't leave much time for all of the other foundational skills. Teachers said there's simply not enough time to do everything. Every year they add something to the literacy block, but not time. 10 years ago, we taught phonics for 15 minutes a day and moved on. Now we're asked to do between 30 and 45 minutes. So that finding was a yes, but. Our second finding had to do with something that's very important, and that's the development of oral language. As those of you know, oral language and language comprehension is an extremely important part of comprehension. What we found was that English learners have less access to dedicated language development support. They have less access, and I'm going to illustrate that finding in a minute. Teachers reported that English language development, or ESL, is not viewed as being as important as phonics in the new SOR programs. When teachers say they can't fit everything into the language arts block, they are asked by people in their districts to move phonics to ELD, and phonics is not English language development. And we know how important English language development is to the development of comprehension in students who carry the label as English learners or emerging bilingual students. Teachers reported that pacing in many SOR program materials was a challenge for emerging bilingual students because the concepts are covered too quickly, and they're difficult for students to follow or grasp. This is exacerbated by the fact that there is little time for review of these concepts. Teachers were told, or have been told, to just keep the pace and turn the page, even if the children weren't getting it. This comment applied to new arrivals as well as to English learners or emerging bilingual kids who were farther along in their development of English. I just skipped a slide. Let me go back. Sorry about that. From teachers' voices, we heard the following. The pacing guidelines of the curriculum have replaced the needs of the students, even newcomers, in deciding what and how to teach. And we all know that we want to make some of these decisions based on what children can do. They want ELD to just piggyback on the literacy work that's happening. They don't want it to be ELD. They want it to be an extension of foundational skills. And again, we know that that is very problematic for our kids who are emerging bilingual learners. ELD should be a part of protected Tier 1 instruction and carefully delineated from phonics and other foundational skills. Teaching all children the same lesson with the same pacing and the same methods does not mean having high expectations. So this is some of the comments that we've taken from what teachers have told us. Our third finding is about a narrowed literacy program. Comprehensive literacy instruction is now overly focused on foundational skills. That's the third finding, and I'm going to elaborate on it. The reductionist curriculum is a particular concern for teachers, and it manifests itself in the upper elementary grades when research indicates that students can be quite adept at decoding and even fluent reading, but they can lag behind in comprehension. And we've got years of research in the field of second language acquisition and literacy to support that. The majority, 66% of our respondents responded that there is a pivot away from oral language development and a similar de-emphasis on writing. Many said, writing is just one sentence or fill in the blank, no composition. Many teachers reported, this is extremely important to me, that they have a long literacy block, but very few books and materials that promote reading books of choice for enjoyment. Children read slide decks, but not books. Okay, these are further, our school says these kids need to learn how to read. They need to learn to decode, and they need to learn how to be a fluent reader. No comprehension, strictly phonics. This is a direct quote from several teachers. My students know how to read, meaning decoding, but they do not understand what they are reading. Teaching nonsense words eats into time needed to teach real vocabulary through oral language, writing, and building content, language, and comprehension, all of which have been already shortened because of the increased phonics time. And this one should break all of our hearts. My kids really hate to read. And this is a researcher comment. Besides reducing the time multilingual students spend on essential literacy components like comprehension, oral language, and writing, any literacy program that results in students really hating reading and who are deprived of text they want to read deserves interrogation. And that's what we're offering with this report. Okay, the fourth finding has to do with threats to dual language programs, and especially with regard to implementation and sustainability are at risk. And this is, again, an amplification of the finding. The time requirements and phonics focus that characterize many SOR-aligned curricula also encroach on dual language and bilingual programs, resulting in less time for teaching in two languages, and we know how important that is in our dual language programs. Teachers reported that some schools are placing less value on bilingualism and biliteracy, and there seems to be an erosion of teaching Spanish for Spanish's sake. Spanish is once again thought to be only important as a means to get to English. There is still a dearth of books in Spanish and a tendency for the Spanish curriculum to echo the English curriculum instead of being a part of what kids need to grow in the language. Many programs are designed as parallel monolingual programs and not for biliteracy. There's little attention to teaching foundational skills or other literacy skills using materials that are authentic to the language. Very important point. It is assumed too often that teaching literacy in Spanish is the same as teaching literacy in English. There are still fewer books in Spanish than English, and overall, there are still inequitable resources to teach literacy in Spanish and other non-English languages. Attention to biliteracy and biliteracy pedagogy is absent in both professional development and materials. Further, some teachers are being asked to stop using bilingual materials that they have used in the past because they are not SOR approved, and no replacement materials have been suggested. Okay, I am going to skip this one because we have teacher testimonials, but one of the things I think that is important is that this particular comment by a teacher, the science of reading gives you all the information about how to teach in reading. Everything is in English. All of the resources are in English. The professional learning sessions are in English, and Spanish is always unprotected. They teach you how to teach the syllables in English, how to teach the sounds, everything in English, but they do not give you anything in Spanish. And we heard this about several other languages. Now, I'm going to stop here. Those are the first four findings. We have three more, but we also have a panel of four distinguished guests, and I'm going to ask them to respond to and amplify these four findings from experiences in their own districts. And so responding to question one is, I believe, is Beatriz. Would you like, no, not you? Maureen? I had a sticky note here. Oh, here we go. Maureen.
Yes.
Maureen, our colleague from Chicago, will be responding to finding number one.
Hi, thank you, Kathy. Yeah, when it comes to teaching foundational skills, we know we need to teach foundational skills. I think all teachers know that, especially in the primary grades, but also with English language learners in the intermediate grades as well. I mean, we always do the best with what we have, but equally important, we know that we need time for English language development. And if we're teaching students how to decode words that they don't already use in their own daily oral language, then it doesn't really make sense for them. The oral language teaching is really the most important. I have a ESL teacher friend who now feels like she's a TA because she's told to only push into literacy classes or reading class, reading specifically time during her teaching day, instead of being able to pull her English language learners, who some of them are newcomers, into her classroom and really develop their language in English. She's being pushed to really work on the decoding and learning the phonics. So that is an issue for us.
Thank you. So I hear from you two things that we have heard throughout the report, and that is, one is decoding without understanding, which is problematic. And the second one is our highly trained ELD teachers or ESL teachers are now being asked to teach phonics instead of teaching oral language development. So Wendy Sue, you had said you wanted to amplify the findings from finding 2, which is about the phonics encroaching on ELD time. So
Yes, thank you so much, Kathy. Again, I'm Wendy Sue Clausen. English as a second language teacher in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I completely agree with number 2. Number 2 really spoke to me. I feel foundational skills are very important, just like we are all saying as educators, but they should not take over for our English language development. English language development happens really for a person learning their first language from before birth. It's a process. It takes time. There's steps to it. The parroting, the mimicking, the learning simple vocabulary like, outside, inside, shoe, blanket, things like that. So think about it. We really are all language learners in a sense, because we all need to learn our first language to communicate with. So imagine as a second language learner, taking that time away from them where they can really develop that oral language, that vocabulary, learning how to ask questions and answering questions, having simple conversations, and having that background knowledge in all areas, whether it be from the routines of a school day or asking to go to the nurse, as detailed as having to learn about the phases of the moon and complete their science activities. So yeah, the language development time really needs to be that. It needs to be language development time. So I've tried this year to really dedicate time to everything, incorporate some phonics and reading skills into what we're doing, but I do really value and try to keep that time sacred for our language learners as language development.
thank you very much. And I hear you say language needs to be developed in context, and vocabulary development is an important part of this. And we can't reduce that to teaching kids to decode.
No, not at all. Not at all. They really have, like I said, if you're talking about tying your shoes or going to the nurse, they need to know how to say that stuff first before they're going to be able to decode those words and read those words. And that's just natural for all of us as language learners.
Thank you very much. Julie, you were going to respond to finding number 3.
Yes, and just for a little bit of context, I'm also at an elementary school, and we have 2 dual language programs, a Spanish, English, and a Portuguese, and they're both 50-50. The school started in 2001, so we've seen a lot of reforms in that time. I think the first thing that resonates with me is the intensity of the programs. They require that sort of what we have, one of the All Green Ed reports curricula, and that's one of the criteria, I think. And it really being state mandated, it sucks a lot of the energy away from some of the other things. And so this finding talked about kids reading for pleasure. I had a teacher share a comic with me that there's a child with a teacher, and the child says, I paraphrase, summarize, outlined, compared, contrasted, and inferred. Can I just read now? And I think that in addition to just reading for pleasure, which the reading in the curriculum that we're using, which I think is strong in many ways, but it's all focused on doing research in order to then write. And so that's kind of the extent of the type of reading that they're asked to do, even in the genre of narrative. And then other activities just take a back seat. So some of the on-hands science work and some of the social studies work. And at this time, I guess I also just want to speak to the context of all of this. So we had the high quality curricula and the science of reading mandates for professional development. Then COVID came. Then post-COVID, academic and social and emotional needs came. And now the current context, political context with, our students in particular, it's been a really tough time, I think, to teach. And, with this focus and it sort of being unrelenting. Specific to dual language, the curricula we're using was not designed for dual language. It's not available in Portuguese. And so that has taken away students' ability to read and write and engage in literacy activities in the same way in Portuguese. It's not designed for dual language. And so there's been a tremendous amount of time and energy spent trying to figure out how to dual languageize it. In order to, you can't just teach two curricula or we'd be here till 8 o'clock at night. And that, it's tough. And the sequencing of the teaching of some of those foundational skills is not really designed in a dual language way. And so I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to hear voices from the field, because I think all of us have been, this has had a huge impact on our work in the last, several years, 4 or 5 years.
Thank you so much, Julie. Beatriz, you are also going to speak to finding number 4, which is dual language. And so what would you like to add to what Julie said so that I don't infringe on your time?
Thank you so much. Yes, on the same line of Julie's comments, we see that in dual language programs that we now have the goal of bilingualism, biliteracy, academic achievement, and social cultural competence. We see the impact of the science of reading is not allowing that much time for the target language. And so we have 50-50 programs and 90-10 programs that face a difficulty in their language allocation plan, right? When they're trying to see, okay, how are the instructional minutes going to reflect their 50-50 model or the 90-10 model? Because usually with a strong and expensive instructional resource or textbook adoption comes stronger guidelines as to what the teacher is expected to do during that ELA time, but not so much during the language arts in Spanish time. So it really puts so much more emphasis on ELA, and Spanish kind of falls through the cracks or just like take a backseat in the curriculum.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on for the sake of time, but our distinguished panel will be back with us to comment on the next 3 findings also. Now, for some reason, there we go. Yay, here comes the slide. So finding number 5, there are 3 final findings. And the first one is access to the full curriculum for all students has been reduced. And again, breaking that down, for years, this preceded the science of reading. Teachers have expressed concerns that efforts to improve reading and math have left very little time for teaching science, social studies, music, and the arts. In this study, teachers indicated that with the new SOR mandates and extra time required for teaching foundational skills, there's even less time for science and social studies. And in some cases, they have literally been eliminated from the school day. And what we're finding is many of the materials that are SOR approved don't match the National Science and Social Studies standards. Right. Teachers do not feel that this is equitable, particularly for emerging bilingual and EL students. Many teachers lamented the fact that they had to skip social studies and science in order to dedicate more time to reading because this is what students were going to be taking the test on. So this is reductionism. In our voice, I'm going to add just really quickly reports of one study that was done way back in 1991, where Georgia Garcia, a researcher in our field, looked at kids who were emerging bilingual kids and kids who were monolingual English kids and found that emerging bilingual kids did not have access to some of the stuff that was on the test, specifically chimpanzees, Canada, and erosive forces. There were 6 topics tested, and 3 of them were about the chimpanzees, Canada, and erosive forces. What she found was when the kids had the opportunity, the emerging bilingual kids had the opportunities to learn the same stuff as the monolingual kids. They had the very same results on the test. But when the bilingual kids didn't have access to the content, it looked like they were far behind, and the culprit that was blamed was language, when it really wasn't language, it was opportunities to learn. So that's finding 5. Finding 6, our teachers report negative impacts on their professional practice. And let me kind of break that down, because these were related to teacher agency and overall teacher well-being. And there are really mixed findings, and I really think this is something that bears a lot more study and conversation with teachers. Some teachers were expected to implement new programs with minimal guidance. In other words, here's our new science of reading materials, go to it. Others were given very strict scripts with PowerPoint slides and told not to deviate from them. So it went all the way from no guidance to here's what you got to do and you can't deviate. Some felt they had the freedom to design their reading blocks. Some believed their professional autonomy was being replaced by pre-made scripts. And some of them had rigid guiding pacing practices, but all felt pressure to adhere to these guidelines, even when students struggled to follow along. And I think that's the most important thing. This inconsistency, we've called the confused, the stressed, and the resistant. The inconsistency of implementation has caused anxiety and confusion, especially for new teachers. In our sample, 62% of participants had been in their roles for 5 years or less. And most of us who have been teachers know we don't hit a stride until we've been teaching at least 5 years. Teachers face concerns about losing autonomy. And despite the pressure, some resisted implementing practices not responsive to the needs of emerging bilingual kids. In other words, they continued incorporating beneficial activities such as read-alouds, daily writing, and oral language teaching. So they resisted the impulse to just give up everything to the 45 minutes of phonics teaching. Teachers very much resisted giving up culturally responsive teaching. And recall that all of these data were collected prior to the last election, and take that for whatever you will. Our final finding has to do with culturally relevant and inclusive curriculum and content, and teachers reporting that some of the materials lacked this important component. Our teachers repeatedly cited a lack of cultural inclusiveness in some of the mandated materials, and at times cultural relevance. They reported that at best, there was only marginal or token inclusion of any kind of diversity in the curriculum, including materials that were specified to teach foundational skills and that were focused on teaching knowledge. Some teachers went so far as to say their materials presented biased and ethnocentric perspective. No teacher, none, reported having SOR curriculum that addressed social justice issues. None. I want to repeat that again. Our teachers cited over 55 different materials and publishing companies that were being used. So this finding isn't an indictment on any one particular program, but this is over 45 different materials. But in fact, many of these materials replaced teacher developed materials that did address culturally relevant materials and social justice. 50% of the respondents said that culturally responsive materials and curriculum were absent. Teachers who did have materials labeled as culturally responsive voiced concerns over the quality, historical accuracy, and appropriateness of these materials by telling us they had even found some of the lessons offensive. These findings raise concerns for both emerging bilingual and monolingual English kids because, frankly, they also need to learn about cultural differences. So here's a teacher testimonials, and then we're going to go back to our panel. One teacher said, I used to teach that Thanksgiving is a day of celebration in some cultures and a day of mourning on many Native American reservations and communities. Now I have a program that teaches only that the Indians and Pilgrims made friends and had Thanksgiving together. I told my principal I was not teaching this unless I could teach both sides. A few teachers, is another quote from a teacher, a few teachers met with our principal to say that we are concerned that our materials are completely lacking in social justice. And we would remind everyone that ethnocentric content, even if it's translated into Spanish, is still ethnocentric. As some teachers said, that they felt their districts thought if we translate this into Spanish, it will all be fine. So we need more research before I turn back to our panel. We need to expand our predictive validity research in the science of reading programs beyond the primary grades. What impact is this having on student outcomes? Because we know that it's having a great deal of impact on our teachers. We need to examine the consequences of reduced science and social studies teaching. And we need to review mandated content for ethnocentrism, representation, and cultural relevance. Okay, now I'm going to go back to our panel, who are going to provide and amplify what in their school districts, how their school districts are taking these on and how they relate to these findings. So Maureen, you were going to respond to finding number 5.
Sure. Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, we had a lot of publishers come in as part of our curriculum audit and trying to perhaps look at a new curriculum for our dual language program. And they have all these suggested, times for their literacy blocks. But and we specifically asked them, are the science and social studies standards covered in these literacy blocks, because you're saying that the content is science and social studies content, but they were able to answer us that no, the social studies and science standards are not covered, and we would still need extra time for that during the day. I mean, I love the fact that they're integrating science and social studies topics, of course, like finally we're getting integrated curriculum, and that's great, integrated with content. But what about the skills, the science and social studies skills that are within the standards as well? I don't know if our kids are going to have time for inquiry and classifying materials and data analysis anymore. And we also had such great, rich art projects involved with our units as well, our teacher-made units as well. And I don't see them having time to be able to do that with all these other policies put on top of them.
Thank you. So I think that we go back to the finding, more has been added except for no more time.
Right.
And so even if one wanted to do science and social studies in addition to what they're being asked to do, there simply isn't time in the school day, nor is what's being offered in some of the literacy material sufficient to cover the kinds of science and social studies standards that we know are nationally recommended. So Beatrice, you also wanted to comment on finding 5.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. Yeah, on that idea of not having enough time, we know that in the context of dual language programs, we still have a strong tradition of duplicating things in the other language, leaving less and less time. And when we know that good practices such as integrated content areas, thematic units, the integrated curriculum is really leaving a lot in the hands of teachers to figure out on their own, when the school system, the school district should be able to provide more support, more guidance, so that the program is being structured at the district and their school level and not at every classroom level without articulation, because then that will leave less opportunities for students to experience social studies and science. And in the context of dual language programs, how are they experiencing that content in both languages to achieve that, to achieve academically and develop that social cultural competence?
Thank you very much. So true. Julie, move on here. Julie, you wanted to comment on finding number 6.
Yeah, so I think, I've heard from several of our teachers that they have abandoned certain previous practices that they thought were effective and brought joy, read alouds, book clubs, responding to the moment when there might be something happening. Well, the curriculum that we have actually does address some social justice issues. It's not up to the day when things are happening. As already has been talked about, language acquisition strategies are not integral. We've tried to plan them in, but again, there's a lot of time that it requires to make that happen. Being culturally responsive to all cultures. So again, we have a strong Lusophone population here, and the curriculum is not available in Portuguese, and there's nothing that shows them, even on the English side, in those books. The data entry is also very intense in terms of having to not only assess children, but also to enter it. And, I've heard teachers, and it really is hard for them to keep up with. And despite that, I've heard teachers say, but I still do X, Y, and Z, which I know as a teacher with 25 years of experience is an effective way. And so that's hard. It leads to, and I think we're very open in trying to problem solve this together, but tension between interventionists and teachers. Why isn't the data in? And it's really, it's a challenge to do it. And then also, with administration, our state has, as many states do, a survey that's given to students, families, and staff every year. And that data is published in terms of many aspects of school life. But I noticed this year that the response to whether teachers felt that they had autonomy in terms of curriculum and teaching and learning was extremely low. And it's because they don't, and neither do we as administrators. And then there's also a bill right now before our state legislature that will use this survey data in order to evaluate schools for their report card. And so when it's state mandated and it impacts you on the ground, and people don't realize sort of what the implications of that are, and then it might be used again to evaluate what you're doing at the school level, it just gets really defeating, I think. We were an international baccalaureate school, and had just become one at the time this all was mandated, and we had to drop that. And yet it's still listed as a best practice by our state, but yet we can't fit in the transdisciplinary units when you have 120 minutes mandated for literacy and 120 minutes mandated for math. So I think that, one of the ways teachers have talked about this is the fun is gone. There's just so much required, and not all of it is bad. I'm not saying that. A lot of it is actually good, and some of our teachers have developed in ways they hadn't before, but it's so intense. And it's just, it's very stress inducing.
Yeah, and when the fun is gone for teachers, we have to wonder if the fun is also going to be lost for kids. We have Maureen. You had wanted to make a comment about finding 7, and then we will move on to recommendations with Shelley, with our colleague Shelley.
Thank you. Yeah, we have so many wonderful social justice units that are developed in our district. And unfortunately, once we adopt a program, that's not going to be included anymore. We have these teachers working on these amazing topics that really speak to our students on a deep level, and their families as well. And that when we look at the publishing, there's no topics whatsoever about social justice. So that's something our teachers are going to have a really hard time with adopting, and they're going to want to sneak those social justice topics in at any time of the day. And they we'll let them do that. We want them to do that, but I don't know with what time they're going to be able to do that. So that is still a frustration for us when it comes to the published materials.
So I hear you say, and I'm going to move on to Shelley because she's going to give us recommendations that were amplified from this report. But I want to say many teachers in many places have poured their heart and souls into creating teacher developed materials that were friendly and culturally appropriate and responsive to local communities. and local school districts, and to be told that those now have to be all set aside for something that's more generic and less culturally responsive, I think is a real problem and something else that we need to add to something that needs further study. So Shelley, thank you all to the panel. You're wonderful, wonderful information, and certainly amplified the findings. Shelley.
So I would just like to say thank you to everybody also, but what I'd like to say before I start the recommendations is that we are hopeful, we are very hopeful, is that the messages and what we're hearing from the field are listened to so that we can improve our practice. Our aim for this is to really make sure that high quality instruction, high quality literacy instruction is available to all students, but that we really have to pay special attention to students who are coming to our schools speaking a language other than English. So this is really to hopefully improve the field. And before I go to the recommendations, you'll see we have recommendations for every single person or entity that is working with our schools and with students and with the issue of literacy, because it's a system-wide effort that we need to put forward. So I'm going to go forward with the recommendations, and you'll find yourself in one of the other set of recommendations. So first off, we really want to address the issue for policymakers. And so we really are suggesting that there's a need to revise current state legislation and policies to align to a more comprehensive approach to literacy and biliteracy with an explicit focus on emergent bilinguals and English learners. When we looked at state literacy, what we saw from state to state to state, in many, many instances, they were cookie cutters. And they were implemented several years ago. And there's really time now that we need to review what's in that state legislation, because it sets the parameters for what goes on in the school districts. We need to develop federal, state, and local policies to vigorously implement and expand dual language and developmental bilingual programs in multiple languages so we can foster biliteracy. And now for the state departments of education, what we saw also in states across the nation is once the legislation is passed, the state departments produce guidance and directives for their school districts. And so again, it's now time for the states to look at their guidance and to look at their directives and to make sure that not only is it aligned with the science of reading, but with the research for literacy instruction for emergent bilinguals and English learners, and to address some of the issues that we've raised here in the webinar. And it's also time for states to update their directives with specific recommendations for emergent bilinguals and English learners, and not just wait for later, do a whole set of directives, and then our teachers will say, but what about our classrooms? And then they'll have to go back. We think they need to be integral in all of the state directives going to the school districts. And so our recommendation for the state departments of education is they really develop guidance for a comprehensive literacy by literacy model. And those models would include strategies of engagement so that we see songs, poems, access to books, a variety of opportunities to teach language as connected discourse. And what's so important is that students really have access to books. You saw the teachers were saying so much of the work was done on devices or with other tools. And so for us, this really means there's a need for funding for books, for class libraries, and time to read. We also think that the departments could really help by developing grade level model schedules that show an entire day how there can be access to a full curriculum, including the science, social studies, and the arts. And what's so important, and I think our teachers told us, our educators told us on the panel, is it's so important to integrate literacy with content instruction. Because how do we develop our vocabulary and concepts? Not from just learning skills. We develop it from learning interesting content. And so it's a critical need to integrate content and literacy. And of course, as Kathy and others just talked about, including relevant, culturally relevant materials that are centered on social justice. And so for our school districts, we really think there's a need to increase support for teachers, coaches, and others who are tasked with implementing the Science of Reading initiatives. And again, to modify and to make sure that English learners, emergent bilinguals, are integral in all of those initiatives, integral. And then, of course, to invest resources. This is what we hope that people will do, is to really now in school districts look at what is being done in the name of implementation in the classrooms, and to see what that impact is on the conditions for teachers teaching, and to really have some focus groups with teachers and to find out what it is that's working and what's not working. And of course, it would be good for districts to conduct curriculum bias reviews to ensure equity. And for professional development in the local school districts, teachers have talked to us that if they're going to be doing the science of reading and literacy instruction in Spanish, their professional development ought to be in that language. Otherwise, they're looking at an English delivery for English implementation and having to make that translation. So in Spanish and other languages that are not English, right? We think that their focus on literacy development should focus on the internal structures of non-English languages for dual immersion programs, dual language programs, and that the professional development should be based upon the research for effective literacy instruction for English learners and emergent bilinguals. And it should be structured to integrate that research with instruction and with the high quality of quality books. And then for teachers, we hope that teachers will really spend time focusing their attention on developing oral language. When we looked at the state legislation and the guidance documents from state departments, the issue of oral language was either minimized or almost non-existent. So we really need teachers to focus in on oral language, on writing, and the teaching of comprehension, especially for students who are coming to literacy in a language that they don't understand. And here too, it is so important that designated English language development, or English as a second language, however it's referred to in your state, is not replaced with foundational skills instruction that was designed for native English speakers. And then lastly, we have recommendations for the publishers also. And we think, sometimes teachers go to professional development, there may be good policy, and then the materials that they have don't really help them implement what they know is best for their students. So for the publishers, we're hoping that they will publish materials that are aligned with English learner emergent bilingual research and really support multilingual and marginalized, I'm having a problem with that. Anyways, marginalized language literacy and identity development. We really, as I said before, need the publishers to provide the classrooms with a wide range of books, not only books that include various genres and topics to encourage students to enjoy reading from cover to cover, both for enjoyment and learning. When we walk into classrooms, we want to see students holding books, reading them cover to cover. We hope that the publishers will provide materials that support the elements of a comprehensive approach to literacy that centers the needs of English learners and emergent bilinguals. And again, to publish materials that are culturally and linguistically accurate and relevant. So all of these recommendations you see work as a whole, and it really works to advance a complete system in our schools and in our states and in our districts. I think we're moving. Martha, oh, I think you were good.
We give an opportunity for our panelists to, to provide a last comment to our attendees. So if we can bring back all of the panelists.
Thank you for this opportunity to share what's going on in our classrooms and what we see talking to our teachers. Everybody, all of our students, our teachers want the best for all of our students, and they always are working their hardest to do the best for their students every day and day in and day out. But we need it to be, we need everything that we give them to be supported by evidence, and we need to give them the support to have enough time during the day to be able to cover all the policies and the standards that we want them to cover.
I'll piggyback off of Maureen. I agree with her as well. We're very happy for this opportunity, and we all know we want what's best for our kids. The one piece of advice I want to leave you with is if you are in a building as an educator in this time right now, and you're being pushed to give the SOR, the foundational skills, more so than English language development, see if you can work with your co-teachers, with your reading specialists, even with your math specialists. Like, see if there's a way you can try to work and combine things into context rather than just so isolated. And that is what I've done this year, and it really has helped, since I'm still doing some foundational skills, but I'm valuing and keeping that time of language development. So, brainstorm, see if there's ways in your building you can continue to do that.
I'll go next again. Thank you for the opportunity to hear voices from the field with this study. And then today, I was talking with Shelley before and likening it to basketball. I loved playing basketball as a kid. And, if it's just about the skills and you never get to play the game for fun, then it loses the joy. So play ball, I'm looking forward to the solutions that might come from this and other initiatives to create a balance in helping, everybody develop the skills they need to be effective, but to have the joy return in ways that are responsive to our students.
Muchas gracias also for the invitation to share along this excellent group of this excellent panel. My last piece would be to say that to thank all the questions and comments in the chat. I love reading people's questions and criticism as well, right? Because we all learn from that. I would just end it with an advice, which is to contextualize our recommendations as well in our experience, because especially when we're talking about strong literacy instruction in bilingual education programs, we have to know what program we're in and how does the literacy block and the instruction is supposed to look. And if it's a transitional bilingual program, whether early exit or late exit, whether you are in a dual language program, 50-50, 90-10, whether it's one way or two way, we oftentimes, because it's a complex field, tend to just aggregate, all those strong research and instructional practices for ELLs as if they were all the same in all programs. And while there are similarities, each program has to look, feel, and sound different because they pursue different goals. So just always to contextualize that advice. Thank you.
And so I just want to take the opportunity to thank our panelists, our educators, who lent their voices, and, address the findings in the report. I also want to acknowledge and appreciate our presenters, the authors, Dr. Kathy Escamilla, Dr. Kimberly Strong, and of course our advocate, Shelley Spiegel-Coman, for all their work, and really appreciate all of the participants' engagement in the chat with great questions, with ideas, etc. We really appreciate that, and we will be looking at all of your comments and responses and the questions that you posted in the Q&A. And I thank you very much. I do want to point again that the recording will be posted on the website, multilingualliteracy.org. And you will be sent the recording and the PowerPoint via email also. Apologies to those who could not get on at the beginning of the webinar, and thanks for continuing to try to log on. And with that, again, thank you for your interest in this very important topic. And again, visit us on the website multilingualliteracy.org. Thanks, one and all. Thank you.